The morning sun cast long shadows across the San Francisco docks as Thomas Wheeler adjusted the leather straps of his photographic equipment one final time. The year was 1890, and the 24-year-old had spent his entire inheritance on the finest German camera available, determined to document the untamed wilderness of Yosemite Valley. His hands trembled slightly with excitement as he secured the heavy glass plates that would capture what he believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. "Thomas, you're fussing with that contraption like it's made of spun glass," Margaret O'Brien called out, her Irish accent still thick despite 5 years in California. At 22, she possessed a fierce independence that had scandalized her Boston family when she announced her intention to join this expedition. Her traveling dress was practical yet elegant, tailored specifically for the rigors of wilderness camping. Samuel Curtis emerged from the supply wagon, his weathered face creased with concern. At 26, he was the oldest of the group and the only one with genuine wilderness experience. "The weather reports from the mountains aren't promising," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Early snow possible, and the nights are already dropping below freezing." Eleanor Hayes laughed, a sound like silver bells that made every man at the docks turn their heads. At 21, she was the daughter of a wealthy railroad baron, but her sheltered upbringing had only intensified her hunger for adventure. "Samuel, you worry too much. We have plenty of supplies, and Thomas has planned this expedition down to the smallest detail." Jacob Morrison looked up from his leather-bound journal, where he had been meticulously documenting their departure preparations. The 23-year-old aspiring writer saw this journey as material for the great American novel he was determined to write. "The indigenous peoples have been traveling these lands for centuries," he said thoughtfully. "If they can survive the wilderness, surely 5 educated individuals with modern equipment can manage a simple camping expedition." The wagon lurched as they began their journey eastward, leaving behind the familiar smells of salt air and civilization. As San Francisco disappeared into the morning haze, Thomas felt a strange chill run down his spine, despite the warm September sun. Something about this expedition felt different from his previous photographic ventures closer to the city. "Did anyone else notice how the dock workers kept staring at us?" Eleanor asked, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat against the sun. "There was something in their eyes when we mentioned Yosemite, almost like fear." Margaret shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench seat. "My boarding house landlady crossed herself when I told her where we were going. She muttered something in Italian about cursed ground, but I thought it was just old-world superstition." Samuel's expression darkened. "The Miwok and Paiute tribes have stories about certain areas of the valley, places where people go missing, where time itself seems to bend and twist, but those are just legends, ways to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand." The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they traveled through the California countryside, past golden fields of wheat and small farming communities where curious children waved from dusty yards. But as they moved deeper into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the settlements became fewer and farther between, until finally they saw nothing but endless wilderness stretching toward the granite peaks that seemed to scrape the very heavens. Jacob continued writing in his journal, documenting every detail of their journey. "The landscape changes dramatically as we ascend," he wrote. "The air grows thinner, colder, and there's a quality to the silence here that feels almost alive, as if the mountains themselves are watching our progress with ancient, patient eyes." By evening, they had reached the outskirts of the valley proper. Thomas set up his camera equipment on a rocky outcrop, determined to capture their first view of the legendary Yosemite Falls. As he prepared the glass plate and adjusted the aperture, a sudden gust of wind nearly toppled the expensive apparatus. "Careful there," Samuel said, helping to steady the tripod. "The wind patterns in these valleys can be unpredictable. The granite walls create their own weather systems." As Thomas peered through the viewfinder, something caught his eye. A figure stood near the tree line, too distant to make out clearly, but definitely human. He adjusted the focus, but when he looked again, the figure had vanished completely. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, pointing toward the spot where he had seen the mysterious person. Eleanor squinted in the fading light. "See what? There's nothing there but trees and shadow." Thomas felt that strange chill again, stronger this time. As he packed away his equipment for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by something far older and more dangerous than any wild animal that roamed these ancient granite halls. The morning of their second day brought them to the heart of Yosemite Valley, where towering granite cliffs rose like cathedral walls toward the heavens. Mirror Lake spread before them like a sheet of polished glass, perfectly reflecting the surrounding peaks and creating an otherworldly doubling of reality that made Eleanor gasp in wonder. "This is it," Thomas announced, his voice filled with reverence as he surveyed the pristine landscape. "This is where we'll make our base camp. I've never seen light like this anywhere else in California." Samuel examined the area with a practiced eye, noting the wind patterns, drainage, and natural shelter provided by a cluster of ancient pine trees. "The ground is level here, and we're close enough to the lake for fresh water, but far enough back to avoid any flooding. It's an ideal location." Jacob was already sketching the scene in his journal, trying to capture the ethereal beauty of the reflected mountains. "There's something almost supernatural about this place," he murmured. "As if we've stepped outside the normal world into some realm of pure possibility." Margaret began unpacking their supplies, while Eleanor explored the immediate area, her boots crunching softly on the carpet of pine needles. She discovered a circle of large granite stones, arranged too perfectly to be natural, situated about 30 yards from where they planned to pitch their tents. "Look what I've found," she called out excitedly. "Someone's been here before us." These stones form a perfect fire ring. Thomas approached with his camera equipment, immediately recognizing the photographic potential of the ancient stone circle. "It's clearly been here for years, maybe decades. Look how the lichen has grown across the surfaces, and the way the pine needles have accumulated in the spaces between the stones." Samuel knelt beside the fire ring, running his weathered hands across the granite surfaces. His expression grew troubled as he examined the stones more closely. "These aren't just randomly placed," he said slowly. "The positioning follows a specific pattern, and there are markings carved into some of the stones. Symbols I don't recognize." Eleanor leaned closer to examine the mysterious carvings. The symbols appeared to be a mixture of lines, circles, and spirals, etched deep into the granite with tools that must have required considerable skill and patience. "They're beautiful," she said softly, "almost hypnotic the way they seem to flow from one stone to the next." Jacob began copying the symbols into his journal, his artistic training helping him capture the precise curves and angles of each mysterious mark. "These could be Native American petroglyphs," he suggested. "Perhaps this was a sacred site for the indigenous peoples who lived here before European settlement." As they worked to establish their camp, Thomas noticed something peculiar about the light around the stone circle. While the rest of the valley basked in the normal golden glow of late afternoon sunshine, the area within the ring seemed to shimmer with an almost silver quality, as if the air itself was somehow different there. "The photographic conditions here are extraordinary," he told Margaret as she helped him set up his darkroom tent. "The light has qualities I've never encountered before. It's going to create effects in the photographs that will be absolutely unprecedented." Margaret paused in her work, a sudden chill running down her spine despite the warm afternoon air. "Thomas, there's something strange about this place. Haven't you noticed how quiet it is? We're in the middle of wilderness, but I haven't heard a single bird call or insect sound since we arrived." Now that she mentioned it, Thomas realized she was right. The silence was absolute, broken only by their own voices and the soft whisper of wind through the pine branches. Even the lake seemed to lap against the shore without making any sound, as if they existed in a world where normal acoustic laws no longer applied. Eleanor had begun gathering wood for their evening fire, but every piece she collected felt unnaturally cold to the touch, as if it had been frozen despite the warm weather. "The wood feels strange," she mentioned to Samuel. "Almost like ice, but it's not wet or frozen." Samuel examined a piece of the wood Eleanor had collected. It appeared normal in every way, but when he held it, the same unnatural cold seemed to seep into his bones. "We should be careful with this fire," he warned. "Something about this place doesn't follow the natural laws we're accustomed to." As evening approached, Jacob made a disturbing discovery while exploring the area around their campsite. Hidden beneath a fallen log, he found the remnants of previous camps, rusted metal objects, fragments of cloth, and most unsettling of all, personal items that seemed far too old to have been left by recent visitors. "Look at this," he called the others over, holding up a tarnished silver locket. "This style of jewelry hasn't been fashionable for decades. And here's a pocket watch that stopped at exactly midnight." Thomas examined the pocket watch, noting that despite its age and tarnish, the internal mechanisms appeared to be in perfect working condition. When he wound it, the timepiece began ticking normally, but the hands moved in a peculiar way, sometimes advancing normally, sometimes slowing to an almost imperceptible crawl. "We should document everything we find here," Eleanor suggested. her scientific curiosity overriding any sense of unease. This could be an important archaeological discovery. As darkness began to fall across the valley, they gathered around the ancient stone fire ring to prepare their evening meal. Samuel struck a match to light the kindling they had arranged, but instead of the expected warm orange flames, the fire that sprang to life burned with an eerie blue-white light that cast strange shadows across their faces. The fire provided warmth, but something about its light made them all feel as if they were being watched by unseen eyes hidden in the darkness beyond their camp. And when Thomas looked at his companions' faces in the ghostly firelight, he could have sworn that for just a moment they all appeared decades older, as if time itself was playing tricks on their perception of reality. The third morning of their expedition dawned with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against their very souls. Thomas awoke to find frost covering his tent, despite the warm September weather, and when he stepped outside, his breath formed visible clouds in air that should have been pleasantly mild. The temperature dropped at least 30 degrees overnight, Samuel observed, his voice tight with concern as he examined their supplies. But according to my instruments, it's still 72 degrees. The readings don't match what we're experiencing. Eleanor emerged from her tent, shivering despite being wrapped in multiple layers of blankets. I had the strangest dreams, she said softly. I kept seeing people around our fire, but they were dressed in clothes from decades ago. They were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand their words. Margaret nodded grimly. I heard voices too, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. Just that blue fire burning in the stone ring, even though we banked it hours ago with no fuel to keep it going. Jacob had been awake most of the night, documenting the strange phenomena in his journal by the light of the mysterious flames. The fire never dims, he reported. It burns without consuming the wood, and the flames cast shadows that move independently of any breeze. I've been sketching them, but the patterns keep changing. Thomas set up his camera equipment with trembling hands, determined to capture photographic evidence of the supernatural events they were witnessing. As he prepared the glass plates in his portable darkroom, he noticed that the developing chemicals were behaving strangely, creating swirling patterns that seemed almost alive. We need to document everything, he insisted, his scientific training warring with a growing sense of dread. Whatever is happening here challenges everything we understand about the natural world. Future researchers will need evidence. As the day progressed, the strange phenomena intensified. Shadows fell in directions that defied the position of the sun, and when they looked into Mirror Lake, their reflections appeared to be wearing different clothes, as if the water was showing them from another time period entirely. Eleanor discovered that the mysterious symbols carved into the fire ring stones seemed to glow faintly in her peripheral vision, becoming invisible when she looked directly at them. It's as if they exist between moments, she told the others, like they're flickering in and out of our reality. Samuel's wilderness expertise proved useless in their current situation. His compass spun wildly without settling on magnetic north, and the stars visible during daylight formed constellations that didn't match any he had studied. We're not just in a different place, he said quietly. We're in a different when. By afternoon, Thomas had decided to create a formal group portrait beside the mysterious fire ring. Whatever is happening to us, we need to document this moment, he announced. Future generations need to know we were here, that we experienced these impossible things. They arranged themselves around the ancient stone circle, with Eleanor sitting closest to the fire that burned without fuel. Thomas set his camera's timer mechanism, giving himself 30 seconds to join the group before the shutter would click and capture their image for posterity. Everyone smile, Margaret called out, though her voice carried a tremor of fear. We want to look like we're having the adventure of our lives. Jacob held up his journal, displaying the pages filled with sketches of the strange symbols and phenomena they had witnessed. Samuel placed a protective hand on Eleanor's shoulder, his paternal instincts activated by the increasing danger he sensed around them. As Thomas rushed to take his position in the photograph, he noticed that the blue flames in the fire ring had suddenly flared higher, casting an otherworldly light across their faces. The air around them seemed to shimmer and bend, as if reality itself was becoming fluid. The camera shutter clicked at the exact moment that Eleanor gasped and pointed behind Thomas. "Look," she whispered, "we're not alone." Thomas turned to see dozens of translucent figures emerging from the surrounding forest, men and women dressed in clothing from different eras, some in Native American traditional dress, others in pioneer garb, and still others in more recent attire from the past few decades. All of them had one thing in common. Their faces bore expressions of desperate warning. "They're trying to tell us something," Eleanor said, her voice distant as if she was falling into a trance. "They're saying we need to leave, that this place takes people and never lets them go, but it's too late. The photograph has been taken." Margaret reached for Eleanor's hand, but as their fingers touched, she felt an electric shock that seemed to freeze her blood. Eleanor's skin had become ice-cold, and her eyes were beginning to take on the same translucent quality as the ghostly figures surrounding them. "The fire!" Samuel shouted, noticing that the blue flames were now reaching impossibly high into the sky, forming a column of supernatural light that seemed to connect earth to heaven. "The fire is pulling her in." Thomas tried to move toward his camera to stop the development process, but found himself unable to take a step. The very air had become thick as molasses, trapping him in place as he watched in horror as Eleanor began to fade in and out of visibility. "I can see them all now," Eleanor whispered, her voice echoing as if it came from a great distance. "Every person who ever camped at this site, they're all still here, trapped in the moment their photographs were taken, and now we're going to join them." The ghostly figures pressed closer, their mouths moving in silent screams of warning that came 72 years too late. As the supernatural fire reached its peak intensity, Thomas realized with dawning horror that they hadn't just stumbled upon a cursed campsite. They had walked directly into a trap that had been waiting for them since the moment the first mysterious symbols were carved into those ancient granite stones. The moment the camera shutter closed, reality fractured like glass around them. Thomas felt his consciousness split into fragments, experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. In one, he was still the eager photographer from 1890. In another, he was somehow aware of decades passing in the blink of an eye, watching the world change beyond the boundaries of their cursed campsite. Eleanor's transformation accelerated as the supernatural fire began to die down to its normal blue flicker. Her skin took on an otherworldly pallor, and her movements became slow and dreamlike, as if she was moving through invisible water. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo that seemed to come from years in the future. "I can see it all," she whispered, her eyes reflecting the ghostly flames. "Every moment that will ever happen in this place. The park rangers who will find me in 1962, the scientists who will study me, the fear in their eyes when they realize I haven't aged a single day." Margaret tried desperately to reach Eleanor, but each step toward her friend felt like walking through thick honey. The air itself had become viscous, trapping them in a pocket of distorted time where seconds stretched into hours and minutes compressed into heartbeats. "The photograph," Thomas gasped, understanding finally dawning. "It's not just documenting a moment, it's creating a temporal anchor, trapping our souls at the exact instant the image was captured." Jacob's journal had fallen from his hands, and as it hit the ground, the pages began flipping on their own, revealing text that he had never written. Future entries appeared in his own handwriting, describing events that hadn't happened yet, including detailed accounts of Eleanor's eventual discovery by park rangers 72 years in the future. "Listen to me," Samuel called out, his wilderness survival instincts finally finding something to grasp onto. "We need to destroy the photograph before it fully develops. If we can break the temporal connection, maybe we can escape this trap." But as Thomas looked toward his camera equipment, he saw that the glass plate containing their image was glowing with the same blue light as the fire. The photograph was developing itself, using supernatural energies instead of chemical processes, and the image growing more solid and permanent with each passing second. Eleanor stood up slowly, her movements now completely detached from normal time. As she walked toward the fire ring, her feet seemed to barely touch the ground, and the Victorian dress she wore began to appear newer, as if time was reversing its effects on her clothing while accelerating them on everything else around her. "She's becoming the anchor point," Margaret realized with horror. "The curse is using her as the connection between 1890 and 1962. That's why she'll be found unchanged while the rest of us—" "While the rest of us what?" Jacob demanded, though part of him already knew the answer from the future entries appearing in his journal. "While the rest of us fade away into the spaces between moments," Samuel finished grimly. "We become the ghosts that future campers will glimpse in their peripheral vision, the voices they'll hear whispering warnings in the wind." The translucent figures that had emerged from the forest were now clearly visible, and Thomas could see that they were all previous victims of the cursed campsite. Some wore the buckskin and beads of Native Americans from centuries past, others the rough clothing of gold rush prospectors, and still others the more recent attire of modern campers and hikers. An elderly Native American man, his form more solid than the others, stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "I am Running Bear of the Ahwahnechee people. I was the first to be trapped here over 200 years ago. The spirits of this place feed on captured time, growing stronger with each soul they claim." "How do we break free?" Thomas asked desperately, watching as Eleanor continued her slow transformation into a temporal prisoner. "Only one can remain anchored to serve as the bridge between past and future," Running Bear explained sorrowfully. "The others must choose, fade into the between time as spirits, or find a way to escape before the photograph fully manifests in the physical world." Margaret looked at her friends with tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor is already too far gone. The curse has chosen her as its anchor, but maybe the rest of us still have a chance." Jacob noticed that his journal had stopped writing future events and was now showing a map of the valley with various paths marked in glowing ink. "Look," he called out, "the journal is showing us escape routes, but they're all leading away from Eleanor. If we leave her behind, we might be able to break free." "We're not abandoning her," Thomas declared firmly, though his voice shook with the magnitude of their situation. "There has to be another way. Science created this problem with the photograph, and science can solve it." But even as he spoke, Thomas could feel his own connection to linear time beginning to weaken. His movements were becoming slower, more deliberate, and when he looked at his hands, they seemed to flicker between solid flesh and translucent spirit form. Eleanor turned back to face them one final time, and in her eyes they could see the terrible knowledge of what was to come. "Don't mourn for me," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of decades. "I'll be waiting here when the world needs proof that some mysteries can never be solved. But you must go now while you still can choose your fate." The blue fire suddenly flared again, and in its light they could see the completed photograph floating above the flames, showing all 5 of them smiling around the cursed fire ring, unaware that they had just sealed their supernatural fate. As the image solidified into permanent existence, Thomas felt the last of his free will slipping away, and he realized with dawning terror that their expedition into Yosemite's wilderness had become a one-way journey into a nightmare that would span the centuries. As the supernatural fire reached its crescendo, Thomas made a desperate decision that would echo through the decades. Fighting against the temporal distortion that was slowly claiming his soul, he lunged toward his camera equipment with the last of his physical strength. "If I can't destroy the photograph, maybe I can change what it captures," he gasped, his hands trembling as he adjusted the camera's focusing mechanism. The glass plate containing their image pulsed with otherworldly energy, but Thomas noticed that certain elements of the photograph seemed malleable, as if the supernatural forces hadn't yet locked every detail into permanence. Margaret understood his plan immediately. "The temporal anchor needs all 5 of us to remain stable," she said, her scientific mind working furiously despite the impossible circumstances. "If we can remove ourselves from the image while leaving Eleanor as the sole subject, we might disrupt the curse's power over us." Jacob's journal continued writing itself, the pages now filled with complex diagrams showing the flow of temporal energy around their campsite. "According to these calculations," he said, his voice growing fainter as his own connection to linear time weakened, "we have perhaps minutes before our spiritual essence becomes permanently bound to this location." Samuel, drawing on his wilderness survival instincts one final time, began gathering their scattered belongings. "If we're going to attempt an escape, we need to move as one unit. The curse seems to work by isolating individuals, making them easier to trap in the between time." Eleanor, now almost completely transformed into her timeless state, watched their frantic preparations with eyes that held the sadness of decades. "You don't understand," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had already lived through countless years of imprisonment. "The curse doesn't just trap bodies and souls, it traps the very essence of who we are, preserving us as we were in this moment for all eternity." Running Bear's spirit form approached them, his ancient face etched with centuries of regret. "In my time, we called this place Pohono's Trap, after the evil wind spirit that steals breath from the living. The white man's photograph machine has made the trap more powerful than my people ever imagined." Thomas felt his consciousness beginning to split again, part of him existing in 1890, while another part somehow perceived the future discovery of Eleanor in 1962. He could see the faces of the park rangers who would find her, unchanged and terrified, sitting exactly where she sat now beside the impossible blue flames. "The photograph is becoming solid," Margaret observed, watching as the image above the flames grew more substantial. Once it fully manifests in the physical world, there will be no escape for any of us. Jacob made the first attempt to break free, following one of the glowing paths shown in his self-writing journal. As he stepped beyond the immediate influence of the fire ring, his form began to flicker more violently between solid and translucent states. "I can feel the pull weakening," he called back. "But there's something else here, something hungry that feeds on escaped souls." From the surrounding forest came a sound like wind through dead leaves, but they all recognized it as the hunting cry of something far more sinister than any natural predator. The space between the trees filled with writhing shadows that seemed to reach toward Jacob with grasping tendrils of pure darkness. "The valley itself won't let us leave," Samuel realized with growing horror. "The curse has turned the entire area into a supernatural prison. We're not just trapped at this campsite, we're trapped in Yosemite itself." Margaret tried a different approach, using her scientific knowledge to understand the patterns of energy flowing around them. "The temporal distortion follows specific rules," she said, her voice becoming echo-like as her own transformation began. "If we can synchronize our movements with the natural rhythm of the curse, we might be able to slip through the gaps." But as she attempted to time her escape with the pulse of the supernatural fire, the flames suddenly roared higher, creating a wall of blue light that surrounded their entire campsite. Within that barrier, time moved differently for each of them. Thomas experienced hours in seconds, while Jacob felt seconds stretch into hours. Eleanor stood up one final time, her transformation now complete. She appeared exactly as she would be found in 1962, young, beautiful, and filled with an eternal terror that would never fade. "I can see all of your possible futures," she said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who existed outside normal time. "Thomas, your photographs will be discovered by researchers who will spend decades trying to understand how you captured images of your own disappearance." She turned to Margaret. "Your scientific notes will be found scattered around the valley, written in handwriting that ages decades between sentences, documenting experiments with time itself that no human mind was meant to comprehend." To Samuel, she said, "Your wilderness skills will help you survive longest as a spirit, but you'll spend eternity trying to warn other campers away from this cursed place, never able to make them hear your voice." And finally, to Jacob, "Your journal will be found by every group that camps here, always appearing when they need guidance, writing itself to help them understand the danger, but the knowledge will always come too late." The photograph above the flames suddenly dropped, landing in the fire ring where it should have been consumed, but instead became a permanent part of the supernatural blaze. In that instant, Thomas felt his connection to the physical world snap like a broken chain. His last coherent thought before fading into the between-time was a desperate hope that someday someone would understand what had happened here and find a way to break the curse that would keep Eleanor frozen in terror for 72 long years. Park Ranger William Bill Thornton had been patrolling Yosemite's backcountry for 23 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he discovered on that crisp October morning in 1962. Following reports of an unusual blue light seen near Mirror Lake during the previous night, he approached the area with the casual confidence of a man who had investigated hundreds of false alarms and abandoned campsites. The first sign that something was wrong came when his radio began crackling with static as he neared the lake. The interference grew worse with each step, until finally the device emitted nothing but white noise, punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like human voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify. "Dispatch, this is Thornton at Mirror Lake," he called into his radio, but received no response except for an echo of his own voice played back at half speed, as if the words were being dragged through thick syrup. As he crested the small ridge overlooking their usual patrol route, Bill saw the smoke first. A thin column of white vapor rose from what appeared to be an active campfire, which immediately set off alarm bells in his experienced mind. October nights in Yosemite were cold enough to warrant a fire, but responsible campers always extinguished their flames completely before leaving their sites. What he found when he reached the source of the smoke, however, defied every rational explanation his 45-year-old mind could muster. Sitting beside an ancient stone fire ring, exactly as if she were waiting for friends to return from a morning hike, was a young woman in Victorian-era clothing that looked as pristine as if it had been tailored yesterday. Eleanor Hayes appeared exactly as she had in 1890, her 21-year-old face unmarked by the 72 years that had passed since the photograph was taken. Her eyes held a depth of knowledge and terror that seemed impossibly old, but her skin remained smooth and youthful, her golden hair still perfectly arranged despite spending decades in the wilderness. "Miss, are you all right?" Bill called out, his training overriding his shock as he approached the impossible scene. The fire burning in the stone ring cast the same eerie blue light that had been reported, and the flames seemed to dance without any visible fuel to sustain them. Eleanor turned toward him slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she was afraid that sudden motion might shatter the delicate balance that kept her anchored to reality. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured accent of educated society from the late 19th century. "You're the ranger," she said, and somehow she made the statement sound like both a question and a recognition of destiny fulfilled. "I've been waiting for you. Thomas said you would come eventually, though I didn't understand at the time that he was seeing forward while trapped in the between time." Bill felt his hand instinctively move toward his service weapon, not out of fear of the young woman, but because every instinct developed over 2 decades in law enforcement was screaming that he was in the presence of something fundamentally wrong with the natural order. "Miss, I need you to tell me your name and how you got here," he said, falling back on standard procedure, even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "Are you injured? Are there other people with you?" Eleanor's laugh was like silver bells, but underneath the musical sound lay a note of hysteria that had been building for 7 decades. "My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I arrived here in September of 1890 with 4 dear friends who are now somewhere in the spaces between moments, trying desperately to warn people like you about the dangers of this place." Bill keyed his radio again, hoping the interference had cleared, but the device only crackled with more of the strange voices speaking in temporal echoes. "I need to report this to my supervisor," he muttered, though he had no idea how to begin explaining what he was witnessing. "Your radio won't work here," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "The temporal distortion interferes with modern communication devices. My friend Margaret would have found that fascinating, if she hadn't become a spirit trapped in eternal scientific observation of phenomena she can never fully document." As Bill looked more closely at the campsite, he began to notice details that made his skin crawl. The area around the fire ring was littered with personal belongings from different eras, a leather saddlebag that looked like it belonged in a museum, a pocket watch that ticked at irregular intervals, pieces of clothing that spanned decades of fashion, and photographic equipment that was far too advanced for the Victorian era, but too primitive for 1962. "These things belong to other people who camped here," Eleanor explained, following his gaze. "Every few years someone discovers this place and decides it would make a perfect campsite. The curse collects them all, though most don't last as long as I have. They fade into the between time much more quickly." Bill noticed movement in his peripheral vision and turned to see translucent figures moving through the trees surrounding the campsite. They appeared to be people from different time periods, all trying to communicate something urgent through gestures and expressions of desperate warning. "Those are my friends," Eleanor said sadly. "Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, and Jacob. They've been trying to warn people away from this place for 72 years, but the living can rarely see or hear them clearly. You're more sensitive than most, Ranger Thornton." "How do you know my name?" Bill asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. Eleanor gestured toward the supernatural fire, and in its blue flames Bill could see images forming and dissolving like scenes from a movie. He saw himself arriving at the campsite, saw his own shocked face discovering Eleanor, and somehow impossibly, he saw scenes of what appeared to be his own future actions over the coming days and weeks. "Time works differently here," Eleanor explained. "Past, present, and future exist simultaneously. I've watched this moment of our meeting thousands of times over the decades, just as I've watched all the failed attempts to rescue me or understand what happened to my friends." Bill realized with growing horror that he wasn't just discovering a missing person or investigating an unusual incident. He had stumbled into something that challenged the very foundations of reality, and Eleanor Hayes was the living proof that some mysteries were never meant to be solved by rational minds. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Mirror Lake campsite 3 days after Ranger Thornton's initial report, leading a team of anthropologists, physicians, and federal investigators who had been hastily assembled to study what government officials were privately calling the most significant anomaly in recorded American history. The 38-year-old anthropologist from UC Berkeley had spent her career studying indigenous cultures and unexplained phenomena, but nothing in her academic background had prepared her for her first encounter with Eleanor Hayes. As she approached the young woman sitting beside the impossible blue fire, Sarah felt as if she was stepping backward through time itself. "Miss Hayes," Sarah said carefully, setting down her recording equipment at what she hoped was a safe distance from the supernatural flames. "I'm Dr. Mitchell from the University of California. I'd like to ask you some questions about your experience here, if you're willing to speak with me." Eleanor looked up from the fire where she had been watching images of past and future events dance in the blue flames. Her eyes held the patience of someone who had lived through the same conversations countless times before, yet retained the innocent appearance of a 21-year-old woman from 1890. "You're the third Dr. Mitchell to study me," Eleanor said with a sad smile. "Your grandfather visited in 1923, and your father came in 1941 during the war years. The family resemblance is quite remarkable across the generations." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Her grandfather had indeed been an archaeologist who had worked in California during the 1920s, though family records showed he had died in an automobile accident in 1924. Her father had been a military researcher during World War II, but had never mentioned visiting Yosemite in any official capacity. "How could you possibly know about my family?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would challenge everything she understood about linear time. "I've watched this conversation many times," Eleanor replied. "In the flames I can see all the people who will come to study me over the decades. Your great-granddaughter will be here in 2019, using technology that looks like magic to my Victorian sensibilities." Dr. James Crawford, the team's physician, approached with his medical equipment, his face showing the skepticism of a man trained in empirical science. "Miss, I'd like to perform some basic medical tests to verify your physical condition. What you're claiming is medically impossible, and there must be a rational explanation." Eleanor extended her arm for the blood pressure cuff with the resigned cooperation of someone who had endured countless medical examinations over the decades. "You'll find that my vital signs are exactly what they were in 1890, she said calmly. "Blood pressure, heart rate, even the small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident will match the description in my family's medical records, if any still exist." As Dr. Crawford took her pulse, his confident expression gradually changed to one of bewildered concern. "This is impossible," he muttered, checking his instruments repeatedly. "Your physiological readings suggest someone in perfect health at age 21, but there are cellular markers that seem to indicate extreme age, as if your body exists in multiple time states simultaneously." Agent Robert Hayes from the newly formed Federal Paranormal Investigation Unit had been documenting everything with both traditional cameras and the latest electromagnetic recording devices. "The photography equipment is malfunctioning," he reported. "Every image comes out showing additional figures that aren't visible to the naked eye, and the film seems to be developing scenes from different time periods." Eleanor gestured toward the ghostly forms moving through the trees around their campsite. "Those are my friends from the original expedition. Thomas would be fascinated by your modern cameras, though I suspect they're capturing more than you intended, because this place exists outside normal temporal boundaries." Sarah began taking detailed notes, trying to maintain her scientific objectivity, despite the mounting evidence that conventional explanations were inadequate. "Eleanor, can you tell me exactly what happened during your camping trip in 1890? Start from the beginning and include every detail you can remember." "I remember everything," Eleanor said, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone recounting events that felt both ancient and immediate. "Thomas was so excited about his new German camera. He wanted to document the wilderness before civilization changed it forever. If only we had known that some places should never be documented, that some images trap more than light and shadow." As Eleanor began her account of the expedition, strange phenomena manifested around the campsite. Sarah's notebook began writing additional information in margins, details that Eleanor hadn't spoken aloud, but that somehow supplemented her narrative. Dr. Crawford's medical instruments registered readings that fluctuated wildly, as if Eleanor's very presence caused reality to become unstable. "The photograph that Thomas took," Eleanor continued, "it's still here, somewhere in the fire. Every night at midnight it appears in the flames for exactly 1 minute, showing all 5 of us as we were in that final moment before the curse claimed us." Agent Hayes checked his watch, noting that it was currently 11:47 p.m. "If what you're saying is true, we should be able to observe this phenomenon in 13 minutes. Eleanor nodded sadly. "You'll see us all there, smiling and happy, completely unaware that we were posing for our own supernatural imprisonment. Thomas in his expedition clothes, Margaret with her practical traveling dress, Samuel with his weather-beaten hat, Jacob clutching his journal, and me in my finest Victorian dress, believing we were simply creating a memento of a wonderful adventure. As midnight approached, the team gathered around the fire ring, their scientific instruments aimed at the blue flames that had burned without fuel for 72 years. Sarah found herself holding her breath, aware that she was about to witness something that would either validate or completely shatter Eleanor's impossible story. "There," Eleanor whispered as the clock struck 12. "Do you see them? Do you see my friends?" In the dancing blue flames, as clear as if it had been taken moments before, the photograph materialized. 5 young people smiled out at them from 1890, captured forever in a moment of joy that had become their eternal prison, while Eleanor sat beside them in 1962, unchanged and alone, the living proof that some mysteries transcend the boundaries of human understanding. The morning after witnessing the midnight photograph, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's team had grown from 4 investigators to nearly 20 specialists, including quantum physicists, temporal theorists, and even a representative from the newly classified Project Blue Book. The campsite now resembled a small research station, with equipment tents and monitoring devices arranged in careful patterns around Eleanor's supernatural prison. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a quantum physicist from MIT, studied the readings from her experimental temporal detection devices with growing amazement. "The energy signatures here don't match anything in known physics," she reported to the assembled team. "We're detecting chronoton particles that shouldn't exist according to current scientific understanding, and they're emanating from that fire ring in patterns that suggest intelligent design." Eleanor watched the scientists work with the detached interest of someone who had observed similar investigations countless times in the flames of temporal vision. "Your Dr. Hartman will publish 3 papers on her findings here," she told Sarah quietly. "The first will be dismissed by the scientific community. The second will be classified by the government. The third will never be completed because she'll disappear in 1967 while attempting to recreate these conditions in a laboratory setting." Sarah felt a familiar chill at Eleanor's casual prophecies of future events. Over the past week, several of Eleanor's predictions about small matters had proven unnervingly accurate, lending credibility to her more disturbing claims about the fates of those who studied her too closely. Agent Hayes had been in contact with Washington, D.C. throughout the investigation, providing daily reports to superiors who were struggling to classify an incident that fell outside all established protocols. "The Pentagon wants to know if this phenomenon could be weaponized," he confided to Sarah during a brief private moment. "They're particularly interested in the temporal displacement aspects. That would be extraordinarily dangerous," Eleanor interjected from across the campsite, her supernatural hearing apparently allowing her to monitor conversations that should have been private. "The military scientists who will attempt to harness this power in 1968 will succeed only in creating a temporal rift that swallows an entire research facility in Nevada. The desert still bears the scar where time itself was torn open." Dr. Crawford had been conducting increasingly sophisticated medical tests on Eleanor, each one revealing new impossibilities that challenged fundamental understanding of biology and aging. "Her cellular structure exists in a state of temporal suspension," he explained to the gathered researchers. "Every cell appears to be exactly as it was in 1890, yet they show awareness of all the time that has passed, as if they're experiencing multiple decades simultaneously." The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Hartman's equipment detected similar temporal signatures at other locations throughout Yosemite Valley. "This isn't an isolated incident," she announced grimly. "There are at least 12 other sites showing similar chronoton emissions, suggesting that Eleanor's campsite is part of a larger network of temporal anomalies." Eleanor nodded sadly at this revelation. "The entire valley sits atop what my friend Jacob's journal called thin places, where the boundary between normal time and eternity has worn dangerously thin. The Native Americans knew this and marked the dangerous areas with warnings that European settlers dismissed as superstition. Sarah had been researching historical records of mysterious disappearances in Yosemite, uncovering a pattern that stretched back to the earliest documented visits by non-indigenous peoples. "I've found records of missing persons cases going back to 1851, she reported. "Hikers, campers, and even some early park rangers who simply vanished without a trace, always near locations that now show temporal anomalies." Jacob Morrison's journal, which had been among the artifacts found at the campsite, continued to write itself each night, providing detailed maps of the dangerous areas and describing the fates of various missing persons. The pages revealed that some disappeared individuals had become trapped in temporal loops, reliving the same day forever, while others had been scattered across different time periods, appearing briefly in historical records separated by decades. "The journal shows that Thomas is still trying to help people," Eleanor explained, as the team studied the self-writing pages. "His spirit has learned to manipulate the temporal energy to provide warnings and guidance, though most people dismiss the appearing text as hallucinations or psychological stress." Dr. Hartman made a startling discovery when she attempted to map the temporal field surrounding Eleanor. "She's not just trapped in 1890, the physicist announced. Her consciousness exists simultaneously across all the years between then and now. She's experiencing every moment of those 72 years at once, which explains her knowledge of future events." This revelation prompted a new series of experiments designed to understand the mechanics of Eleanor's temporal imprisonment. As the scientists worked, Eleanor began describing her subjective experience of existing outside linear time. "Imagine feeling every emotion you've ever experienced simultaneously," she told them. "The joy of arriving in Yosemite in 1890, the terror of realizing we were trapped, the loneliness of decades spent waiting, the brief hope each time new investigators arrive, and the sadness of knowing how each attempt to help me will ultimately fail. All of these feelings exist in me at once, every moment of every day." Agent Hayes had been monitoring radio communications from other government agencies and made a disturbing announcement. Other federal departments are reporting similar temporal anomalies at locations across the country. Gettysburg, Salem, parts of New Orleans, several sites along the Oregon Trail. It appears that America has numerous places where traumatic historical events have created permanent tears in the fabric of time. Eleanor's expression grew grave at this news. "The photograph that trapped us wasn't just capturing our images," she said. "It was recording the moment when innocence met ancient malevolence. Every location where similar traumas occurred risks becoming another temporal prison, another place where the past refuses to release its grip on the present." As the second week of investigation began, the team faced a troubling realization. The more they studied Eleanor and her supernatural predicament, the more they became entangled in the temporal anomaly themselves. Their equipment was beginning to malfunction in ways that suggested chronological contamination, and several team members reported dreams of living through historical events they had never experienced. Dr. Mitchell found herself writing research notes in handwriting that looked increasingly like Eleanor's Victorian script, documenting discoveries she had no memory of making, as if her consciousness was beginning to drift across multiple time periods, just like the young woman she was trying to help. Dr. Sarah Mitchell awoke on the 15th day of the investigation to find her tent filled with belongings that weren't hers. Victorian-era clothing hung from improvised hooks. A leather-bound journal lay open beside her sleeping bag, showing entries written in her own handwriting but describing events from 1890, and most disturbing of all, a daguerreotype photograph showed her own face beneath an elaborate 19th-century hat. "It's happening to all of us," Dr. Crawford announced during the morning briefing, his voice shaky with barely controlled panic. "The temporal contamination is accelerating. I woke up with medical knowledge about diseases that were eradicated before I was born, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw myself as I would have appeared as a Civil War battlefield surgeon." Dr. Hartman's quantum equipment had begun displaying readings that defied interpretation. The instrument showed multiple temporal signatures for each team member, as if every person in the camp existed simultaneously across different time periods. "We're not just studying the anomaly anymore," she said grimly. "We're becoming part of it." Eleanor watched their growing distress with the sad compassion of someone who had witnessed this same progression countless times. "The proximity to the temporal field gradually breaks down the barriers that keep individual consciousness anchored to a single timeline," she explained. "You're beginning to experience what I've lived with for 72 years, awareness of multiple versions of yourselves across different eras." Agent Hayes had lost contact with his government superiors 3 days earlier when his radio equipment began receiving transmissions from federal agencies that wouldn't exist for decades. The messages he intercepted described government programs dealing with temporal anomalies that suggested the phenomenon would eventually spread far beyond Yosemite. "I received a transmission yesterday from someone claiming to be Agent Hayes from 1987, he reported with disturbing calm. He was warning me about decisions I haven't made yet, describing the consequences of actions I'm apparently going to take in the future. The most unsettling part is that his voice sounded exactly like mine, but older and filled with regret. Sarah discovered that her research notes had been supplementing themselves with information she had never learned. Pages of her notebooks contained detailed analyses of temporal physics that were far beyond her educational background, written in handwriting that was recognizably hers, but somehow different, as if created by a version of herself with decades more experience. The Eleanor effect, as Dr. Hartman had begun calling it, was manifesting differently in each team member. Some experienced memories from past versions of themselves, while others gained knowledge from future iterations. Dr. Crawford found himself able to diagnose medical conditions using techniques that wouldn't be developed until the 1980s, while Agent Hayes demonstrated tactical knowledge from military conflicts that hadn't yet occurred. The most disturbing case was Dr. Hartman herself, who had begun speaking occasionally in languages she had never studied, discussing quantum theories that wouldn't be formulated until the 21st century. When questioned about these episodes, she claimed no memory of them, suggesting that her consciousness was temporarily being replaced by future versions of herself. The temporal field around this campsite is expanding, Eleanor warned them. Each person who stays here too long becomes another anchor point, another node in the network that's slowly converting Yosemite Valley into a place where linear time no longer applies. Jacob Morrison's self-writing journal had begun producing warnings specifically addressed to each team member, describing their individual fates if they remained much longer. Sarah read her own entry with growing horror. Dr. Mitchell will become the lead researcher on Project Kronos in 1975, using knowledge gained here to create temporal weapons that will ultimately threaten the stability of reality itself. These aren't predictions, Eleanor clarified. They're observations of actual future events. Jacob's spirit exists across all timelines simultaneously, allowing him to document what will happen to each of you if you don't escape soon. Dr. Crawford made the decision to evacuate non-essential personnel after discovering that several team members had begun aging at different rates. Some appeared to have gained years overnight, while others seemed to be growing younger, their faces taking on characteristics from earlier periods of their lives. The temporal contamination is becoming irreversible for some of us, he announced. We need to reduce our exposure before we all become permanent residents of this anomaly. But when the evacuation team arrived the next morning, they found something that chilled everyone to the bone. The new arrivals couldn't see Eleanor at all. To their eyes, the campsite appeared abandoned, except for the research team, who seemed to be conducting intensive studies of an empty fire ring. We're becoming part of the anomaly ourselves, Sarah realized with dawning horror. The people coming to help us exist in normal time, while we're shifting into the same temporal state as Eleanor. Soon, we'll be just as invisible to the outside world as she is. Eleanor nodded sadly. This is how the network expands. Each investigation team that stays too long becomes another group of temporal prisoners, visible only to other victims of the phenomenon. The government has files on dozens of research teams that have simply vanished while studying similar sites. Agent Hayes made a desperate attempt to contact the outside world using conventional radio equipment, but every transmission he sent seemed to be received by the same agencies in different time periods. His calls for help were answered by versions of his own department, from the 1940s, the 1980s, and even the 2020s, creating a temporal communication loop that provided no actual assistance. Time is a spiral here, Eleanor explained, as the team struggled with their deteriorating situation. Past, present, and future coexist in the same space, which is why you're receiving responses from different eras. Your messages are being heard, but by people who exist decades before and after your current timeline. Dr. Hartman made one final attempt to understand the scientific principles governing their predicament, but her equipment now showed readings that suggested the entire campsite had become unstuck from normal space-time. We're not in 1962 anymore, she announced with scientific precision despite her obvious terror. We're in a temporal bubble that contains fragments of every year since 1890. As the sun set on what they all sensed might be their last day as individuals anchored to linear time, the team gathered around Eleanor's eternal fire to hear her final warnings about the choice they would soon be forced to make, attempt a desperate escape that might scatter their consciousness across multiple timelines, or accept their fate as the newest guardians of Yosemite's darkest secret. On what Dr. Sarah Mitchell calculated to be October 31st, 1962, though time had become increasingly meaningless within the expanding temporal anomaly, the research team made their final desperate attempt to escape before becoming permanent additions to Eleanor's supernatural prison. Dr. Hartman had discovered a potential weakness in the temporal field during her analysis of the quantum readings. "The anomaly pulses in regular intervals," she explained to the assembled team, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had somehow gained decades of theoretical physics knowledge overnight. "Every 72 hours, exactly at 3:17 a.m., the temporal barriers weaken for approximately 90 seconds. It's our only chance." Eleanor watched their preparations with the heartbreaking expression of someone who had seen countless escape attempts fail over the decades. "You don't understand the true nature of this place," she warned them. "The temporal field doesn't just trap people in time, it feeds on their attempts to escape, growing stronger with each failed effort." Agent Hayes had been monitoring the expanding anomaly's effects on their equipment and personnel. 3 team members had already begun experiencing what he termed temporal fade, becoming translucent during certain hours as their consciousness drifted between different time periods. Dr. Crawford himself had started aging rapidly during daylight hours, only to return to his normal appearance after sunset. "The field is adapting to our presence," Hayes reported grimly. "It's learning our individual temporal signatures and customizing the effects to trap each of us more effectively. We have perhaps one more day before the contamination becomes irreversible for all of us." Sarah had been studying Jacob Morrison's self-writing journal, which continued to provide warnings and guidance from beyond the boundaries of linear time. The most recent entries described the specific fate awaiting each team member if they failed to escape. Dr. Mitchell will become the temporal historian, documenting every soul trapped in the expanding network. Dr. Hartman will become the quantum anchor, her consciousness spread across multiple realities to stabilize the growing anomaly. Agent Hayes will become the eternal guardian, warning future investigators while being unable to prevent their entrapment. "The journal is trying to help us," Eleanor explained. "Jacob's spirit has learned to manipulate the temporal energy to create brief windows of opportunity. But using those windows requires a sacrifice that none of you are prepared to make." Dr. Crawford made the first attempt at escape, using medical stimulants to artificially anchor his consciousness to 1962 while physically moving beyond the anomaly's boundaries. As he crossed the perimeter where their instruments detected the weakening temporal field, his form began to flicker between multiple ages: a young medical student, a middle-aged researcher, an elderly physician, and something that looked disturbingly like a corpse. "I can see all of my possible lives," he called back to them, his voice echoing across multiple decades. "Every choice I never made, every path I didn't take. The temporal field shows you every version of yourself that could have existed." But before he could complete his escape, Dr. Crawford's form stabilized into something that was neither fully alive nor entirely dead. He had become another ghost trapped in the between-time, visible to the team but unable to communicate coherently, forever caught in the moment of his failed escape attempt. Dr. Hartman attempted a more scientific approach, using her quantum equipment to create what she called a temporal tunnel, through which they might pass safely back to normal time. The machinery hummed with otherworldly energy as it carved a visible distortion in the air near the edge of their campsite. "The tunnel is stable," she announced, though her equipment readings showed energy patterns that violated every law of physics she had ever studied. "We have perhaps 5 minutes before the anomaly adapts and closes this pathway." Sarah volunteered to test the tunnel first, but as she approached the shimmering distortion, Eleanor called out a final warning. "The tunnel doesn't lead back to 1962. It leads to every year you've ever lived, simultaneously. You'll experience your entire lifetime in an instant, and most minds cannot survive that level of temporal compression." Agent Hayes made the decision for all of them, pushing past Sarah toward the temporal tunnel with the grim determination of someone who had accepted that survival might require sacrificing his sanity. As he entered the distortion, his body seemed to stretch across multiple decades, showing him as a child, an adult, and an elderly man all at the same time. "I can see the future," he gasped as the temporal energies tore at his consciousness. "The government will classify this entire incident and pretend it never happened, but the anomalies will continue spreading, creating a hidden network of temporal prisons across America." The tunnel collapsed before anyone else could follow Hayes through, trapping him halfway between 1962 and some other point in time. His final transmission, received on Sarah's radio equipment, came from the year 1987. "This is Agent Hayes. The escape was successful, but the cost was everything. I exist now as a temporal refugee, jumping between decades, trying to warn people about what's coming." With their escape routes exhausted and their team scattered across multiple timelines, Sarah and Dr. Hartman faced the terrible realization that they had become exactly what Eleanor had warned them they would become: permanent residents of the anomaly, destined to warn future investigators while being powerless to prevent their entrapment. "There is one final option," Eleanor said quietly as the sun rose on what might be their last day as individuals. "The same choice my friends made in 1890. You can accept your fate and join me as guardians of this place, or you can fight the temporal field until it tears your consciousness apart and scatters the pieces across eternity." Sarah looked at the ghostly forms of Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, and Jacob moving through the trees around their campsite, understanding finally that they had chosen to become protectors rather than victims, spending their eternal imprisonment trying to save others from the same fate. "We'll stay," Sarah decided, speaking for herself and Dr. Hartman, "but we'll find a way to warn people more effectively than our predecessors managed. Science created this problem, and science will eventually solve it." Eleanor smiled for the first time since 1890, no longer alone in her temporal prison, as the newest members of Yosemite's supernatural guardians took their places around the eternal blue fire that would burn until someone found a way to break the cycle of entrapment that had claimed so many souls. By 1987, 25 years after the failed rescue attempt, the temporal anomaly at Mirror Lake had grown from a localized phenomenon into something far more sinister. Agent Hayes, now existing as a temporal refugee jumping between decades, had documented the expansion of what government files classified as Project Kronos sites across the American landscape. Eleanor Hayes, still appearing exactly as she had in 1890, had been joined by Dr. Sarah Mitchell and Dr. Elizabeth Hartman as permanent guardians of the cursed campsite. The three women existed in a state of temporal suspension, watching decades pass in accelerated sequences while experiencing every moment with perfect clarity. "The network is spreading faster than we anticipated," Sarah reported to Eleanor, her consciousness now capable of perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously. 17 new sites have manifested across the country, each one triggered by traumatic historical events, combined with photographic documentation. The pattern had become clear through decades of observation. Locations where significant emotional trauma had occurred became vulnerable to temporal disruption when documented through photography or other recording methods. Civil War battlefields, sites of Native American massacres, locations of industrial disasters, and places where families had experienced profound loss all showed signs of developing similar anomalies. Dr. Hartman, whose scientific knowledge had expanded exponentially during her temporal imprisonment, had developed the ability to communicate with other trapped researchers across the growing network. "Gettysburg has 14 confirmed temporal prisoners," she reported. "The Salem site has captured 6 paranormal investigators since 1975. Even the crash site of Flight 93 is showing early signs of chronoton emissions." Eleanor had evolved during her century-plus of imprisonment, developing abilities that allowed her to influence the temporal field in limited ways. She had learned to control the blue flames that burned eternally in the stone fire ring, using them to send warnings to sensitive individuals who might be approaching dangerous sites. Thomas learned to manipulate Jacob's journal to provide warnings, Eleanor explained to her fellow guardians. "I've discovered that I can influence photographic equipment to malfunction when people attempt to document areas with high temporal instability. It's not enough to stop everyone, but it saves some lives." The government response to the expanding network had evolved as well. Project Blue Book had been replaced by more specialized agencies that dealt specifically with temporal anomalies. Agent Hayes, in his scattered existence across multiple decades, had provided intelligence from the future that allowed authorities to identify potential sites before they fully manifested. The Pentagon established the Temporal Security Division in 1979, Hayes reported during one of his brief materializations in the present timeline. By 2001, they'll have documented over 300 sites showing varying degrees of chronoton activity. The problem is growing exponentially. One of the most disturbing developments was the discovery that some individuals seemed naturally immune to temporal entrapment, while others were particularly susceptible. These temporal sensitives were being recruited by various government agencies for reasons that the Guardians found deeply troubling. They're experimenting with weaponizing the effect, Dr. Hartman reported, after receiving communications from trapped researchers at a classified facility in Nevada. The military is attempting to create portable temporal fields that could trap enemy forces in time loops or accelerate aging to neutralize threats. Eleanor watched these developments with the heavy heart of someone who had seen the innocent enthusiasm of 1890 transform into the dangerous ambitions of the modern world. "We tried to document the beauty of nature," she said sadly. "Instead, we opened doorways to forces that humanity was never meant to control." The three Guardians had developed a system for warning potential victims that was more effective than the ghostly whispers and appearing journals that previous generations had relied upon. Sarah's anthropological training allowed her to influence local Native American communities to share traditional warnings about dangerous sites, while Dr. Hartman found ways to feed scientific data to researchers that would lead them away from temporal hotspots. The Ahwahnechee Tribal Council has agreed to post official warnings at 12 locations throughout Yosemite, Sarah reported. They understand the danger better than government officials because their oral traditions have preserved knowledge of these thin places for centuries. However, the Guardians faced a new challenge as the temporal network expanded. Some of the newer sites were developing aggressive characteristics that their location had never exhibited. These active anomalies didn't wait for people to stumble into them. Instead, they seemed to actively lure victims through various supernatural means. "The Antietam site has begun manifesting false emergencies," Dr. Hartman reported with concern. "Hikers hear cries for help from the battlefield, and when they investigate, they find themselves trapped in the temporal field while trying to rescue victims who died over a century ago." Eleanor had discovered that she could occasionally communicate with other primary anchors in the network, individuals like herself who had been chosen by the temporal fields to serve as permanent bridges between different time periods. The conversations revealed that each site had its own personality and methods of operation. "The woman at the Salem site was trapped in 1692, Eleanor reported after one such communication. "She's been there for nearly 3 centuries, watching witch trial reenactments that trap tourists in loops of historical events. The trauma of the original trials created a temporal wound